Headley.
And I'm Ryan Wolf.
Our greatest responsibility is to serve our
Treasure Valley communities,
the El Paso, Las Cruces communities,
Eastern Iowa communities,
Mid-Michigan communities.
We are extremely proud of the quality, balanced journalism that CBS 4 News produces.
But we are concerned about the trouble and irresponsible, one-sided news stories
plaguing our country.
The sharing of biased and false news has become all too common on social media. More alarming, some media outlets publish these same fake stories without checking facts first.
The sharing of biased and
false news has become all too common on social media.
More alarming, some media outlets publish these stories simply aren't true without checking facts first.
Unfortunately, some members of the media use their platforms to push their own personal bias and agenda to control exactly what people think. And this is extremely dangerous to our democracy.
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 It's a media unbelief, a media unbelief. The whole media is controlled by a few corporations thanks to deregulation by the FCC.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
Disney, Fox, Westinghouse, and good old GE.
They own networks from CBS to CNBC.
They can use them to say whatever they please.
A child's happiness is priceless, right? Especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on their birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially when it comes to their birthday.
And put down the opinions of anyone who disagrees.
Or stuff about PCBs.
What are PCBs?
They come from electric power plants built by Westinghouse and GE.
Absolutely. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. Well, a child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's smile is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
They can give you lots of cancer that can hurt your body.
But on network TV, you rarely hear anything bad about the nuclear industry.
You know, a child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday.
A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. A child's happiness is priceless, especially on a birthday. You like that?
Like when Westinghouse was sued for fraud.
Which time?
GE made defective bolts, it was an unreported crime. Or when it was boycotted for operating nuclear bomb plants just to squeeze a dime.
Shopping for this holiday season. It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
Well, it's okay. You can admit it if you have bought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself. It's okay. You can admit it. You bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's a footnote, by the way.
A footnote protects you from folks who doubt what you say. Now maybe the voices in my head will go away.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you buy an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay. You can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it, Todd. If you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay. You can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself. It's okay. You can admit it if you buy an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself.
But the big shots don't care. They're all sitting pretty thanks to corporate welfare.
What's that now?
They get billions in subsidies from the government.
That's okay, you can admit it if you buy an item or 2 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought 1 or 2 or maybe 3 or 4, maybe even 10 items for yourself. It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 10 for yourself. It's okay, you can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or maybe 10 for yourself.
It's supposed to create jobs, but that's not how it's spent. They use tax and soft money to support congressmen who will vote for weapons programs again and again.
It's okay. You can admit it if you bought maybe an item 2 or 10 for yourself. It's okay. You can admit it if you bought an item or 2 or 3 or 10 for yourself. It's okay. You can admit it if you bought an item
or 10 for yourself?
It's okay. You can admit it if you brought an item or 2 or 10 for you.
And let them dump toxic waste where the young ones play.
INTE made the bullets that shot JFK.
It's okay. You can admit it.
If you bought an item
It's okay. You can admit it. If you want an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay, you can admit it. If you want an item or 2 or 10, say for yourself.
It's okay. Admit it. If you want an item or 2 or 10 for yourself.
It's okay. You can admit it if you bought yourself 1 or 2 or 10 things for yourself.
It's the third time I've said that. I'll probably say it 3 more times. See, in my line of work, you got to keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in.
You contribute to this chain every time you buy a product sponsored on this show.
To kind of catapult the propaganda.
To kind of catapult the propaganda. To kind of catapult the propaganda. That's what NBC doesn't want you to know. Till the next time.
Terrorism, terrorist, terror organization, terrorist attacks, terrorism, terrorist network, terrorist attacks, terrorist group, terrorists, terrorists, instruments of terror, a terror network, terror cells, terrorists, terrorizing terror and murder. They kind of catapult the propaganda. Weapons of terror, terrible weapons of mass destruction, chemical weapons of mass destruction, dangerous weapons, even more dangerous weapons, biological weapons, chemical agents, chemical weapons, chemical attacks, chemical and biological weapons, chemical and biological weapons, ballistic missiles, chemical or biological weapons, chemical or biological attack, chemical and biological attacks, poisons, deadly gases, the biological or chemical weapon, instruments of terror, the instruments of mass death, weapons of mass destruction, nuclear weapon, bomb, nuclear weapons, nuclear program, nuclear weapons program, nuclear scientists, nuclear holy warriors, nuclear program and nuclear weapons, nuclear weapon, nuclear technology, biological or chemical or a nuclear weapon. They kind of catapult the propaganda.
But here you have the Johnny Appleseed of terrorism wandering the country with his little sack of anthrax. 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 Bacterium. Anthrax. Bacterium. Anthrax investigation. Anthrax investigation. Anthrax exposure. Anthrax exposure. Anthrax test. Anthrax test with anthrax scares. Anthrax scares. Anthrax spores. Anthrax spores. Anthrax strains. Anthrax strains. Anthrax hoax. Anthrax hoaxes. Anthrax attack. Anthrax attacks. Cases of anthrax. Anthrax case. Anthrax cases and traces. Traces of anthrax. Traces of anthrax. Traces of anthrax. Skin anthrax. Skin anthrax. Cutaneous anthrax. Cutaneous case of anthrax. Inhaled anthrax. Inhaled anthrax. Inhalation anthrax. Inhalation anthrax. Inhalation anthrax. Inhalation anthrax. Anthrax in the mail. Anthrax through the mail. Anthrax tainted letters. Anthrax tainted letters. Anthrax laced letters. Anthrax laced letters. Anthrax letters. Anthrax letters. Anthrax letters. Anthrax letters. Presence of anthrax. No presence of anthrax. Positive for anthrax. Negative for anthrax. Negative for anthrax. Positive for anthrax.
Behavioral psychologists have come up with new views, not only of animal behavior, but of human nature as well. And these views all concern a process that we take for granted, learning, because we are all truly born to learn. Ironically, one of the most important figures in the study of learning, Ivan Pavlov, wasn't concerned with the subject at all, at least not at first. Pavlov, a noted Russian scientist, won the Nobel Prize for Physiology and Medicine in 1904. As this original footage shows, Pavlov was initially interested in digestion and the action of the salivary glands. By diverting the saliva of dogs into test tubes, he could precisely measure if and how much they salivated during digestion. When food was presented, the dog salivated quickly, an inherited salivary reflex. But over repeated testings, a strange thing happened. The dog salivated before contact with the food. Just the sight of the food was enough to stimulate their drooling. Then, just seeing the food dish, or even hearing the footsteps of Pavlov or his assistants, was enough to trigger this built-in reflex. What was going on to elicit this response? Pavlov decided to find out by systematically varying the stimuli and measuring the dog's reaction. Metronomes, lights, and bells were all used as stimuli, and they all worked as stand-ins for the food. What mattered was not the kind of stimulus that was used, but the fact that it reliably signaled that food was on the way. Pavlov had discovered a fundamental type of learning called classical conditioning. An original stimulus elicits an automatic unlearned response. Both stimulus and response happen naturally. They are unconditioned. Then a second, neutral stimulus that never elicits the unconditioned response by itself is introduced just before the presentation of the original stimulus. If the neutral or signaling stimulus is presented alone, and a response occurs as if the original stimulus were still there, we say that conditioning has taken place. The arbitrary neutral stimulus becomes a conditioned stimulus. The reverse is also true. Pavlov and others studied the extinction over time of such conditioned responses. When the subject learns that the conditioned stimulus no longer signals a desired event, the acquisition process is reversed, as the learned connection is gradually weakened. Pavlov's work, and the work of those who followed him, led to a remarkable conclusion, and that is, any stimulus an organism can perceive is capable of eliciting any reaction the organism is capable of making. This means that virtually any sound, sight, or smell can influence the way our muscles tense or relax, our moods fluctuate, or even the way our attitudes are formed. For instance, if I say, relax, and then do this, you're going to be startled and upset. After 5 or 6 pairings of relax, just saying the word relax is going to generate a negative response rather than its usual learned reaction.
Also has anthrax. But not anthrax. I don't have anthrax. He does not have anthrax. No anthrax. Crop-dusted Omaha with anthrax. Mass spreading of anthrax. Mutant anthrax. Deadly anthrax. Kill any anthrax. Anthrax-fighting drug. Antibiotics. 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 Anthrax vaccine. Smallpox vaccine. That's right. He said smallpox. Smallpox vaccine. That's right. He said smallpox. Back to anthrax. Cure for anthrax. Died from 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 anthrax.
For the next few minutes, I'm going to give you the facts on Ebola. It'll take just 3 minutes.
Ebola.
Ebola.
Ebola. Ebola.
Ebola. Ebola.
Ebola. Ebola. Ebola.
Ebola. Ebola. Ebola. Ebola. Ebola.
Ebola. Ebola.
Ebola. Ebola.
Ebola. Ebola. Ebola.
Ebola.
As you know, this Ebola strain has been much more virulent.
Ebola strain. Ebola strains. Ebola strains.
The Ebola strain.
Ebola strain.
Ebola strain.
What causes Ebola?
Growing Ebola fear spreads around the country.
There are fears the outbreak will continue to spread.
Americans panic over a possible Ebola outbreak.
Fear and panic over a possible Ebola outbreak. Ebola outbreak. Growing fears about Ebola.
Tested for Ebola.
Tested for Ebola.
Tested for Ebola.
Tested for Ebola.
Is there any cure for Ebola?
ZMAP.
So the drug that many people have read about in the media is something called ZMAP.
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 This used to be an orphan drug. What companies now actually see the potential for profit in developing an Ebola therapy?
ZMAP.
ZMAP. ZMAP. ZMAP.
ZMAP.
ZMAP.
They are covering the man in a completely airtight containment unit.
Smallpox scare.
That's right. He said smallpox.
6 vials of deadly smallpox.
That's right. He said smallpox. You're probably dead.
Because somebody might weaponize Ebola.
If I were a bioterrorist and I had a chance to weaponize 5, 6, or 7, I would not pick Ebola.
A country that actually weaponized Ebola.
Is there any cure for Ebola?
Monday, the first of 39 healthy volunteers began getting the experimental Ebola vaccine.
The first ever human trials of an Ebola vaccine.
An Ebola vaccine.
Ebola vaccine.
Forget the conspiracy. Listen to our government agencies. These guys are telling the truth. You know, there's no conspiracy here, folks. Just get your damn vaccine.
Cure for Ebola.
Die from Ebola.
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 Cure for Ebola.
Die from...
Where I was taken to, brothers, was like no cine I ever visited before. I was bound up in a straitjacket, and my Gulliver was strapped to a headrest with like wires running away from it. Then they clamped like lid locks on the eyes, so that I could not shut them, no matter how hard I tried. It seemed a bit crazy to me, but I let them get on with what they wanted to get on with. If I was to be a free young Malchik again in a fortnight's time, I would put up with much in the meantime, oh my brothers.
Like an Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year.
Economic factors may take some spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take some of the spring out of the Easter Bunny step this year. Economic factors may take the spring out of the step of the Easter Bunny this year.
Whoa, that was a big one. I hate it when that happens. Hey, Will, is that you? Of course it's me. Can't you tell? No, not if we all look the same. I don't. Will, we are krill. We are meant to look the same. Not me, Bill. There's only one of me in all the world. I am one in a trillion. Where are you going? I'm leaving! I want to be free, Bill. There's no such thing as free, Will. Come on, less thinking, more swarming. I'm sick of swarming. We've been swarming all our lives. Sometimes, Will, it's like you've got a mind of your own. Tell me, Bill, what lies beyond the swarm? More swarm. And then, some more swarm. And then, Will, there's nothing but swarm. We are a swarm without end. Everything's got an end. See? I end here. That is not a happy ending. It stands to reason, Bill. If I swim against the swarm, I must eventually reach the end of the world.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby.
Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Mike Myers says, yeah, baby. Did I say that right?
Yeah, say it right. Yeah, baby.
You know, and the thing is, about the ownership of the media, I met Rupert Murdoch once. I skied his family down from the mountain in Aspen. I talked to him when he was just coming to this country and when he had just acquired the Chicago Sun-Times. And I talked to him a little bit and skied with his kids. And my question was, how does an Australian publisher of some little newspapers in Australia acquire the capital to come to the United States and take over hundreds of papers and television networks? This is what you have to understand. How this works, well, I've seen how it works in Estonia. I know the media mogul in Estonia. He is made rich by an outside source in Sweden and London. This outside source has created this man, he's a Jewish man in Estonia, to own all the newspapers, all the magazines in that country. So he becomes the kingmaker. And it's the same thing with Rupert Murdoch. Rupert Murdoch is an Orthodox Jew. He keeps that pretty hidden. But his mother was a lady named Green. She was an Orthodox Jew from Australia. And he was funded from the very beginning by the Rothschild Bank. So they create him, and he becomes the vessel. He becomes their man in America. And so, for example, when the United States invaded Iraq, was preparing to invade Iraq in 2003, he owned 160 newspapers. And every one of his editors agreed with him about the need for American troops to go into Iraq. You see how it works? So the readers of all those newspapers in America and Canada and Britain say, yeah, I guess we should go to Iraq. Hey, that makes sense. Because most people, most Americans aren't that savvy when they read the newspaper. They don't put their critical thinking and say, well, maybe these guys are trying to convince us of something. And so we've gone into these wars very blue-eyed, and we've been terribly, terribly abused. Our country's been wasted, plundered. They've taken trillions of dollars. They've killed thousands of our people and many, many thousands of those people over there. And they have taken this country one big step back. And, you know, this is my first time in America in 7 years, but I have never been in a country that is so militarized in my life. You know, it's frightful. But the media is the main tool by which they occupy our minds, by how they deceive us. And I know also that I used to work for a little independent paper, so-called independent paper. The alternative media is also controlled. So it's not as simple as black and white. You say, well, I'm not going to read the New York Times, but I'm going to listen to Alex Jones. You see, you have to understand that it's not so simple. In the alternative media, there's a great deal of control too. So it means that you really have to be able to use your critical thinking skills and sift the wheat from the chaff. You have to tell for yourself what is true and what is not true.
Talk show host Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be able to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on his late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night TV. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope once again on late-night TV. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien is looking to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night TV. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be about to push the envelope on late-night television. Conan O'Brien may be preparing to push the late-night envelope. Well, if you filled up your gas tank lately, then you don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise. You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise. You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise. You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise. And you don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise. You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise. You don't need us to tell you that gas prices are back on the rise.
Because you people and 62 million other Americans are listening to me right now. Because less than 3% of you people read books. Because less than 15% of you read newspapers. Because the only truth you know is what you get over this tube. Right now, there is an entire generation that never knew anything that didn't come out of this tube. This tube is the gospel, the ultimate revelation. This tube can make or break presidents, popes, prime ministers. This tube is the most awesome goddamn force in the whole godless world. And woe is us if it ever falls into the hands of the wrong people.
And welcome back to the show. I scream, you scream. You know the rest. 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 I scream, you scream. Well, you know the rest. I scream, you scream. Well, you know the rest. I scream, you scream. Well, you know the rest. I scream, you scream. You know the rest. I scream, you scream. We all know the rest. I scream, you scream. You know the rest. I scream, you scream. Well, you know the rest. I scream, you scream. You know the rest. I scream, you scream. We all know the rest of it, right? I scream, you scream. Well, you know the rest. I scream, you scream. You know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest. I scream, you scream. You know the rest. I scream, you scream. Well, you know the rest. I scream, you scream. Well, I think you know the rest. I scream, you scream. You know the rest. I scream, you scream, and everybody knows the rest. I scream, you scream. Well, you know the rest. I scream, you scream. You know the rest. I scream, you scream, and you know the rest. I scream, you scream. You know the rest.
I don't find that funny. I find it scary.
Bringing entertainment to thousands of people. Through its magic, we are able to enjoy a combination of the radio, motion pictures, and the stage, right in the comfort of our own homes, simply by pushing a button and turning a dial. These cells with their electrical charges are scanned by a stream of electrons, completing 30 pictures a second. Compare that crude picture with these of today, and you can judge for yourself how far along the road to perfection television has traveled.
Most people still today think that all entertainment to do with movies, drama, is therefore nothing more than their entertainment. It never ever was that case.
Of course, television can't perform such miracles as this, yet. But perhaps there's no harm wishing that it could.
The greatest social messages are promoted through movies and drama, high drama, through the fixation of emotive sequences, emotional sequences, not logical, factual sequences, but pushing points across in an emotional way which register and fix in the mind. So emotional content is very, very important, rather than going through an actual discussion or an argument using logic and facts. There's no debate. And when you're being downloaded through fiction, your guard is down, the sensor part of your brain is not in action. It isn't saying, yes, I agree with this, I disagree with that, as you would in a debate or a lecture. You're actually in an alpha state, being completely downloaded with new ideas. When radio came along, of course, they used that to the maximum. Sports for the men, soaps basically for the women, and then in came television, as I say, with its alpha state, its hypnotic state. And sure enough, around the 1960s, really, 50s and 60s, it took off. It really, really took off. and men became glued on Saturday nights to the sports shows. A culture industry, which is called by its own the culture industry. The Soviet Union had a department called the culture industry. Their actors and directors were called the cultural leaders, because they would, like a computer, people are like computers, all you have to do is keep giving them new updates every so often, and you can change an entire country or a nation or a block of nations who are all getting the same upgrades at the same time along certain paths. Today we call it political correctness. Most people want to belong to their peer group. They want to be the same as everyone else when it comes to opinions. In fact, they judge their own personal sanity by bouncing ideas off their neighbors and friends who will answer back and agree on these same topics in kind. It doesn't matter if the topics or what you're given are facts or utter nonsense, as long as everyone agrees at the same time. You'll say, well, I'm sane, and your friends will all agree because they've had the same information given to them.
But they've been programmed, and I'm sad because I know that it's hard for people like that to take an interest, a serious interest in world affairs, to take a serious interest in what their elected officials are doing. And they're not going to be really inclined to study or discover the deception that's being used against them. And so I'm sad because I see all of that in a flash in my mind as being an indication of how easy it is for the masses to be manipulated.
How does that saying go? The greatest trick the devil ever pulled was to convince people he didn't exist, right? I think the same thing has been done with mind control as a concept. There's been an expansive campaign to try and make everyone think that all that stuff is impossible, it's not real, it's science fiction, it's fantasy, hypnosis doesn't really work, neuro-linguistic programming has supposedly been scientifically debunked. Subliminals don't really work either, even though they've spent decades upon decades refining and using that technology.
Ladies and gentlemen, this commercial is going to use subliminal advertising. Subliminal advertising.
But no, supposedly none of that stuff is real, right? And it's interesting because if you believe that, then it's much easier for the people who know how your brain works to use that information against you.
This isn't real. What is real? How do you define real?
And as the Orwellian destruction of language unfolds all around us, we're seeing the very much intended consequences of the ever-increasing power of words. You know what, let's step back for a second. Have you ever seen this clip of Al Roker? Watch what happens in this clip to Al Roker when this woman says the phrase, Holy Ghost.
That's exactly how you have to have a certain amount of distance between the bodies in your eye.
Yes, like they say in Catholic school, leave room for the Holy Ghost. Anyway, there is a lot of memories today, actually. It's a big day in music.
The man just shuts down like a robot or a Manchurian candidate. Tell me that's not programming. I mean, the guy's not faking it. What the hell is that? She says the phrase, and he just completely right? It seems to me that same technology, which was figured out, by the way, decades ago under unethical Cold War mind control research programs, expansive ones, of which the CIA's MKUltra was actually only a small fragment globally, but that's another story for another time, is being turned upon the masses. And now, what's really being pushed is this concept of trigger words. This did not used to be a concept that was widely publicly discussed. And now, everyone's talking about, she's triggered, he's been triggered, it's a trigger. My 8-year-old is using this phrase now because he heard someone else use it on the internet. Do you see what I'm saying? So now we're really being inundated with the concept of triggering. Let's see what Google says about the word trigger and what it means, since that's where millions upon millions of people get their information from. So let's see what Google says the word trigger means. And you can clearly see straight away that as a noun, trigger has one definition. It's a device that releases a spring or catch that sets off a mechanism, especially in order to fire a gun. Trigger, a noun. But then you have trigger as a verb, which is to cause an event or situation to happen, to cause a device to function, to precipitate, to provoke, to activate. They're activating something. And then look at this last definition, which is the longest one on here. Especially if something read, seen, or heard distress someone, typically as a result of arousing feelings or memories associated with a particular traumatic experience. Quote, she started crying and told me that my news had really triggered her. Don't you think that's interesting, though, that it's not only that trigger is a verb, but they specifically, the longest explanation, the longest definition has to do with how news is an example of how to trigger someone. Do you see that? Now let's take a look at my dictionary from 1941 and look up the word trigger. Oh look, it's a noun. It was not a verb at that time. There's no verb form of the word trigger in this book. Meanwhile, can it really be a coincidence that the same year you had stuff like this coming out is the same year you have it listed that the word trigger started being used in this specific way as a verb to denote the initiation of something or having something be provoked. I'm sure many of you guys noticed that after the switch to digital, specifically after the switch to digital, meaning it's no longer analog television, they can now layer as many signals into the digital signal as they want to, and there's no interference on your screen to let you know what all is being transmitted when they do that.
Just moments away from changing our whole world from analog to digital here, and it's so exciting.
Suddenly you had every major news outlet using these fast spinning globes and circular graphics that are moving very fast, spinning, and a lot of times they count down the viewing audience into the broadcast. It's almost as if they're counting people down into a hypnotic trance with the combination of the flicker rate and these very intricate spinning circular and spherical graphics. And I'm just going to show you a few examples of that. I'm going to slow them all down by 50% so that I'm not just showing you 10 of these in a row and it has some creepy effect on your brain. I just want you to recognize this and see it for what it actually is here. So you have that, especially after 2008, 2009, when they made the big switch. Now that's become the standard. That's just the standard graphics on any mainstream news show that you see anywhere. It's not a coincidence. And then now that that has been perfected and they've been using that for a while, Now, all of a sudden, oddly enough, they're finally starting to admit in the mainstream that hypnosis isn't just some wacky, debunked pseudoscience, but that it actually does work and affect your brain. And this is just one article that's an example of that in Forbes, where they're talking about research shows hypnosis has interesting effects on the brain. There's a lot of controversy about the validity of hypnosis. That's all on purpose. It's been on purpose since they figured it out. Why would they tell everyone how this works and validate it if they hadn't perfected it yet? Anyways, you come down in here and it talks about, does hypnotism affect brain activity? There have been several studies that have shown effects on brain activity after hypnotism. Mendelsohn et al. Studied this through giving people post-hypnotic amnesia. This basically means the hypnotist told people to forget a certain thing after they're hypnotized until they hear a recall trigger word which lets them remember it again. Trigger words. The key place where you will see that phrase up until recently has always been in hypnosis or Manchurian candidates, things like that. Brainwashing, mind control. And now they're really pushing the concept of trigger words on everybody. It's, to me, not a coincidence at all. It really is as if there are people who, they count them down into this trance on the television, they impart the information.
We're counting down to one of President Obama's most important speeches of the year. We're counting down.
Right? And then spin them back out at the end of the show. And it's like mass hypnosis. You remember the phrase from school, probably, sticks and stones may break my bones, but words can never hurt me. Now, they actually want to invert that. They want you to believe that words are some of the most horrible things in the world that can hurt you the most.
Words matter. As parents and individuals, let's create a zero-tolerance zone where offensive words are simply not acceptable. It's not about being politically correct or hypersensitive. It's about doing the right thing.
They are really inundating us with this idea of verbal triggers. They want you to believe and know and hear about how people are triggered, how you could be triggered, your friends could be triggered. Like spells, like a witch casting a spell, like a little programmed biological android. Just responding to stimuli with emotional outbursts, no logic, no critical thought, nothing like that.
What a great honor to be able to introduce for the first time ever.
Tell me this isn't mass mind control, because it really seems like mass mind control. We're seeing this everywhere right now. And one place we're seeing this indoctrination really heavy all across the country is college campuses.
Trigger warnings really facilitate the best education, and they're something that is a necessity on college campuses for a lot of students.
It's not just with the SJW millennials who seem keen to attack their own free speech because someone else's free speech might hurt their feelings. So they're just going to attack free speech, which is actually attacking their own free speech.
Who gets to decide what's offensive? Who gets to decide, guys?
How about
what if everybody says, I am hurt? Does that mean everyone else has to stop speaking?
Which is creepy in its own right, but it's not just them. There are people in every walk of life and group who are right now getting really, really upset by words.
There's a very thick line between being politically incorrect and being racist. And words matter.
You're talking about psychological control of people's minds. It's like the Matrix when Morpheus says they want to take a human being and turn it into this. But actually what it's doing is it's turning people into Al Roker. Because they're taking someone's reality and like programming a bull to react as if he's seen red when it's not really there. That's the amount of psychological control words now have over large portions of people.
If you're talking about what you can feel, what you can smell, what you can taste and see, then real is simply electrical signals interpreted by your brain.
If people are now being engineered to instantly react to certain words, concepts, phrases, things they disagree with, from a place of a hair trigger emotional response to a stimulus that seems to just completely override and bypass all ability for critical thought, and then beyond that to not only question the construct, but question what's going on 2 inches in front of their own face, then how is that not mind control?
You know, I saw this movie last year called Basic Instinct. Okay, now, Bill's quick capsule review, piece of shit. Okay, now, yeah, end of story, by the way. Don't get caught up in that fevered, hyped, phony fucking debate about that piece of shit movie. Is it too sexist? And what about the movies? Are they becoming too... You're just confused. You've forgotten how to judge correctly. Take a deep breath. Look at it again. Oh, it's a piece of shit. Exactly. That's all it is. Satan squatted, let out a loaf. They put a fucking title on it, put it in a marquee. Satan's shit, piece of shit. Walk away. But is it too... What about the lesbian connotation? You're getting really baffled here. Piece of shit. Now walk away. That's all it is. It's nothing more. Free yourself, folks. If you see a piece of shit, say it and walk away. You're right. You're right. Not those fuckers who want to tell you how to think. You're fucking right.